NYPD.
That's Latino NYPD.
Chris Cheney, City of Yonkers, Forensic Lab.
Great.
John Civic, your Connect Forensic Lab.
Kathy Bravo, Underdog County Center for Forensic Sciences. Jean Vito, Monroe County Medical Examiner's Office, Practicality Lab.
James Grinnell, Nassau County Police Department.
Michael Cole, Nassau County Police.
John Burton, CCJS.
Gary Zianski, New York State Police. Mark Monacois, PCJS.
Thank you very much. You may want, if we start to overhear each other and just hear sound effects, you may ask people to put their microphones on pause around the table, which is the button to the right, just to cut down noise back and forth. If you have any trouble in New York City, please start waving your hands in the air so I'll know that you're in distress and we have to come to your assistance. We'll begin today. We don't have a court reporter, but what we are going to do is video the meeting at the same time that we're doing the webcast, so that we will have information preserved in order to do the minutes, or if any questions come up at a later time. We may be joined by a court reporter very shortly, and Dr. Willie just joined us as well. Welcome. So we have a quorum for our meeting, and I'll call the meeting to order. The first item of business is to ask you to review the agenda for today's meeting, which has been provided to you. I think we got the materials out about 3.5 weeks ago, so hopefully you had a chance to look at it. And I would ask if there's, first of all, any discussion about the agenda, or if I could have a motion to approve the meeting agenda. And if you are moving, please state your name, just so we have it for the transcript. Is there a motion to approve the meeting agenda?
So moved.
Second.
John
Okay.
Hicks,
Okay, second. Any objection? All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, the meeting agenda is approved. The next order of business is the draft minutes of our last meeting of March 29, 2007. They were also provided to the Commission approximately 3.5 weeks ago. Are there any amendments to the minutes of March 29? Yes.
Yes, just Marina Stage, just a small thing on page 3, where it states under the chair of the American Board of Forensic Technology is actually the chair of the Accreditation Committee of the American Board of Forensic Toxicology. And
Should we wave hands?
No, we're having a hard time hearing in New York.
We're having a hard time hearing what she's saying.
Okay, we'll repeat it on page 3 of the draft minutes. There is a reference, and you want to pick it up there?
there is a reference to Dr. Jones being the chair of the ABFT. He is actually the chair of the Accreditation Committee of the American Board of Forensic Toxicology. And then also, further down in the same paragraph, the formation of ABFT accreditation program. It was the Society of Forensic Toxicologists in the toxicology section of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences.
Thank you. Those corrections are made and noted. Are there any other additions or corrections to the minutes? May I have a motion to approve the minutes of March 29th? Okay, Bill Fitzpatrick, second?
Second. Richard Jennings.
Okay, any objection? All in favor? Please signal aye.
Aye.
The minutes are approved without objection. At the last meeting, we did introduce a resolution to revise the Commission bylaws to make 2 rather minor corrections. The first, I'll take the first one first, is a proposed change to Article 2, Section 3, which indicates that if the chairperson is absent from the meeting, that the Director of the Office of Forensic Services shall convene the meeting and act as chairperson thereof. Currently, the bylaws provide that only the chair must be present for a meeting. Is there any discussion of that provision of the bylaws and that bylaws change? All right. All in favor of that change to the bylaws, please signal by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposition? Okay. That change will be made. The second change, which we'll implement today, if we agree, is to amend the bylaws to allow members participating by video conference to vote. So that is a proposed change to Article 5, Section 4. Is there any opposition to that proposed change? Could I have a motion? Or we need a motion. All in favor of that change to the bylaws, please signal aye.
Aye.
Any opposition? Okay, that change is approved as well.
I presume perhaps under new business, but at some point, clarification as to whether the open meeting law applies to this meeting and what the governor's order that we allow webcast, that could be under new business, but I think it's a significant issue for this body.
Okay. If no one objects, we can take it up right now since I did start to discuss it. The executive order of the governor does apply. The open meetings law does apply to the commission. We are testing the equipment right now. You may have missed that before you came in. This meeting is not being webcast because the executive order is effective July 1st. Our next meeting will be. So we're trying to work out any kinks with the equipment. We are authorized under the open meetings law by vote of the commissions to go into executive session. We discussed that last time, and as chair, I would recommend that we do that when we get to the point where we are discussing disclosures of lab directors about possible matters that should be referred to the Inspector General, and other areas. If we are discussing personnel at a particular lab, any member of the commission could make a motion that we do go into executive session to discuss certain items that may be sensitive or confidential, and we are authorized to do that upon what's the vote? That's the commission. Is it the majority vote? Yes, the commission to go into executive session. Otherwise, our meetings will be open and will be webcast.
I would think we might need to have some real clear discussion and guidelines about when we're discussing, when we're voting on whether or not to approve or disapprove a lab accreditation. Clearly, that's an open process. But much of our conversation leading up to that vote is very much related to actual performance, inspection, and I think we need to consider whether that is open discussion, and if it's not, whatever the rules or what's not, then we're going to have to be very careful about biting our tongues, perhaps, when we've always been very open and free, and right up until the vote made comments about performance, and we're going to agree that that's executive session because it is specific to individuals and sometimes to cases and sometimes to PP performance and sometimes to inspection elements. I think we're going to need some real clear guidance from the office on should or shouldn't be discussed during open webcast.
Clouds in the sky under the sunshine law.
Well,
we are going to have that discussion. We are going to get to it after we hear from the executive director of AskLab Labs, who gives a presentation for us. We are going to move into laboratory accreditation items. Now, this meeting is not being webcast, but it is open. And so, we may have to have that discussion today. We'll certainly have to have it next meeting if we don't have the discussion today. So let me table it until we get to item number 6, but I'll see how the commission members feel about discussing that issue today. I am very pleased to have Ralph Keaton here, the Executive Director of AskLab Lab. I know that there are a number of issues, even for my short time chairing this commission, regarding the work that AskLab Lab does for us on the commission, and certainly for all of the labs who participate in the accreditation program. And we are very appreciative of the work that you do. We also, I know as commissioners, have a number of questions about your process and a number of questions about how your process is evolving over time. So we appreciate hearing from you today. I understand you're going to speak about the legacy program. And I'd like to introduce you to the members of the commission and ask you to take over from this point.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you all for the invitation to come today. I want to try to give you a real quick overview of the AskLab Lab Accreditation Program and hopefully answer questions that some of you may have.
Can you hear in New York?
We can hear, does he have slides of some kind?
Yes, there's a PowerPoint presentation. I was wondering if you were able to see that.
No.
We can't.
You can't see him, is it?
Okay, not quite sure
Well,
how
maybe-
that.
Maybe on the 6th.
Maybe what can be done is, we'll see it, there'll be a copy of that provided, I take it, and attached to it.
We'll have to provide it. We could attach it to the minutes so that you'll have it.
Be happy to provide a copy of
Okay.
the presentation. You mentioned the accreditation program is evolving, and that's very much true. Actually, the AskLab Lab Accreditation Program is in its 25th year, having accredited its first laboratories just a little over 25 years ago. And the reason the accreditation program came about was because of some voluntary proficiency testing that occurred around the United States in prime laboratories, actually through one of the Department of Justice programs. It was supposed to be confidential, voluntary, but it didn't remain that way long. Some of you may remember, but about 26, 27 years ago, the major newspapers around the United States had headlines, "Prime laboratories perform poorly." Every major newspaper in the United States had that as a front page headline. It was about the same time that a new organization was being created, the American Society of Prime Laboratory Directors, under the direction of FBI Director Clarence Kelly, who called laboratory directors together to try to form some kind of communication channel that didn't exist at that time. As a result of this bad publicity that prime laboratories were getting, one of the first things that was discussed was the need to set some standards of operation for our profession. We recognized that some laboratories were doing outstanding work, some others were not. We didn't have any way of measuring that. We looked at a number of different ways of possibly setting standards of operation. We looked at self-assessment programs, individual certification, and ultimately came down to accreditation with external peer review process as the accepted program. And I'll tell you right now, the program that we had 25 years ago would look very watered down today for a laboratory to go through. It lacked many of the very crucial elements of the accreditation program as it exists at this time. And even as we speak, we have proposals for revisions to the accreditation program that are out for vote at this time on matters related to including requirements for ethics training, proficiency testing, and some other matters that may be incorporated in a revised manual. But I'm going to real quickly try to go through and tell you about the program. The first thing I'd like to do is clarify one of the most common misconceptions about our name. AskLab is really our mother, the American Society of Prime Laboratory Directors, which is an association of laboratory directors that came together and recognized the need to create another program, which is the American Society of Prime Laboratory Directors Laboratory Accreditation Board. Hindsight says we should have had a different name. Thus, obviously, it's kind of hard to go back and correct that. We are separate corporate entities with separate boards of directors. We share some common interests, but our missions are quite different. The objectives of the Accreditation Lab Accreditation Program were spelled out from the very beginning: to improve the quality of laboratory services provided to the criminal justice system, to develop and maintain criteria which can be used by the laboratory to assess its level of performance and to strengthen its operation, to provide an independent, impartial, and objective system by which laboratories can benefit from a total operational review, and to offer to the general public and to users of laboratory services a means of identifying those laboratories which have demonstrated that they meet established standards. The organization of ASCLAD Lab, as it now is constituted, starts with the Delegate Assembly. The directors of all accredited laboratories and laboratory systems form a Delegate Assembly, which is the governing body. Any substantive change in the program must be approved by a 2/3 vote of the Delegate Assembly by mail ballot. This Delegate Assembly has an annual business meeting in which it elects a portion of the Board of Directors. Our Board of Directors is comprised of 10 individuals, 7 of which come from forensic laboratories. We have a representative of law enforcement, or the Friends Association. That member is Kim Nelson, who was a U.S. attorney, and he's been promoted to a position that I'm not sure what his title is at this time, and a member of the public at large constitute our Board of Directors. The Board of Directors employs a staff, including myself, and that staff does most of the day-to-day administrative work of the program. Most important in our program are those volunteers from forensic laboratories around the country. And many of the lab directors here have members of their staff who have been trained as ASCLAD lab inspectors and can assist with the accreditation program. ASCLAD Lab accreditation is for prime laboratories and is granted for a 5-year period, after which a laboratory outside of New York must go through the process. Again, New York obviously is a little bit different in the approach. It's a voluntary program except in 3 states. New York was the first state to mandate accreditation, followed by Oklahoma and Texas. All forensic laboratories in those 3 states must be accredited in order to provide testimony in the course of those states. We have defined a prime laboratory for our purposes, and in our glossary we say a laboratory with at least one full-time scientist which examines physical evidence in criminal matters and provides opinion testimony with respect to such physical evidence in a court of law. And I'll tell you, ASCLAD Lab's position is to not be exclusive, but rather to be more inclusive in its definition. So our definitions of a laboratory and of a scientist are somewhat liberal. By ASCLAD Lab's glossary definition, a person who employs scientific methods in the examination of evidence in a forensic laboratory satisfies the requirements of a forensic scientist or a scientist in the prime laboratory. If we were to use a more traditional definition of scientist, then we would probably exclude some of the forensic sciences such as laboratory examinations. That is not what the accreditation program wishes to do. It wishes to help elevate the standards for everyone working in the profession. There are about 8 disciplines that are accredited by ASCLAD Lab: controlled substances, toxicology, trace evidence, biology, firearms, tool marks, lake prints, question documents, crime scene, and the most recent is digital and multimedia evidence. ASCLAD Lab's position is that we accredit a laboratory as a total quality system. So if you are doing work in several of these disciplines, we would not accredit you in just one of them. We would expect you to become accredited in every discipline in which you provide those forensic services.
You're dropping off?
They're having trouble hearing you.
I'm sorry. Currently, there are 334 laboratories accredited by ASCLAD Labs today. 36 of those are in our international program, which I'll tell you just a little bit about, and 298 are accredited in our legacy program. Of those 334 laboratories, 182 are from state organizations, 100 from local laboratories, 22 federal, 20 private, and 10 laboratories outside of the United States. In 2004, ASCLD Lab began a dual-track accreditation program, basically accrediting under two programs. We made that effective April 1st, 2004. We said at that time we would continue to offer accreditation under our existing program, or the legacy program as it became known, and that we would continue to accept applications in that program through April 1st of 2009, and that we would continue to support those laboratories accredited in that program until all accreditations had expired. In addition to that, we began accepting applications in our program known as ASCLD Lab International, which is an ISO 17025-based accreditation program. The basic difference in the ISO, or International Accreditation Program, is that ISO 17025 standards become the base standards for the accreditation program, because if you are an ISO accrediting body, then that has to be the base of your accreditation. We supplement 17025 in the accreditation of forensic laboratories with those parts of the legacy programs that are essential, that are not covered in ISO 17025, that relate specifically to forensic laboratories, and also from a document known as ILAC G19. The accreditation under the international program also is a 5-year accreditation program with one difference. That is, we require an annual surveillance visit laboratories that are accredited. The difference between a surveillance visit and a regular accreditation inspection visit is the size of the inspection team and the depth of the assessment. The annual surveillance visits will be targeted. They will be different each year, but they will be looking at specific quality issues. And these surveillance visits will also look at things that maybe were issues in previous inspections to make sure that they have not recurred. There are three areas.
Could I just interrupt you there?
You may.
Who's making the determination about when you do surveillance visits?
ASCLD Lab schedules that with the laboratory, but it has to be scheduled within 60 days of the previous year's inspection.
So it's more a follow-up to see if they made the changes that they said they were going to make? Or
Oh, no. We're not following up the changes because they don't get accredited the first time until they're in compliance. It's to ensure continued compliance.
And is it possible to request, for the commission to request a surveillance visit?
Well, you actually do that right now. We are inspecting all of the laboratories in the state of New York that are accredited by ASCLD Lab every 2.5 years rather than every 5 years at the request of the commission. We do have one laboratory in Texas that has requested a full inspection every year. We'll be doing that. But we would work with someone like the commission and schedule more frequent visits as requested.
Thank you.
Clarify that for you. When you move to the international program, I think you said that with that program, there's an annual surveillance visit that's automatically part of the program.
That's going to happen. Yes, we're going to do that every year.
Right. And we do have at least one laboratory and at least a couple that are in the works now to move to the international program. And over the course of the next few years, all of our laboratories should move into that program.
That's correct.
And all these inspections are announced.
Yes, we don't do any unannounced inspections. If we determine that there's a need for what we call an interim inspection, it may not be significant time period before we come in, but we will not come in to the laboratory unannounced. The three areas of focus in the accreditation program are laboratory management and operations, personnel qualifications, and the fiscal plan. The on-site inspections. Most of our inspections are led by a staff inspector who's an employee of ASCLD Lab Currently, AskCloud Lab employs 12 staff inspectors, all of which are currently retired forensic scientists who at one time worked in forensic laboratories and had been inspectors on a volunteer basis. Most of our inspections are led by one of these individuals, but the majority of the team is made up of volunteer inspectors that come out of forensic laboratories and are current active practitioners. And many of the people here have individuals in their laboratories who serve as these volunteer inspectors. All of those who serve as inspectors must have completed the AskCloud Lab Inspector Training Program, have been tested, and in the international program, they have to be assessed and actually evaluated and found to be acceptable to be certified inspector. The size of the inspection team is a function of the size and complexity of the laboratory that we inspect. When we go into a laboratory the size of the New York City Police Department, I don't remember the exact numbers, but we're looking at approximately 30 inspections in that for a full week. If you do one the size of the FBI laboratory, again, we're talking 30, 35 inspectors for at least a full week of on-site inspection. That doesn't count all the time spent prior to the inspection reviewing the documentation that is provided by the laboratory. So these inspections are extremely intensive, and those who've been through it probably verify that. Prior to going into a laboratory, the laboratory must provide an application with a significant amount of documentation, including organizational chart, laboratory quality manual, operational procedures, evidence handling procedures, case records and laboratory security, technical procedures, statements of qualifications for each technical staff member. So the application itself is quite arduous. There are a lot of processes that a laboratory must have in place before they're ready to be inspected. They've got to have procedures to protect evidence. They've got to have validated and documented technical procedures, use of appropriate controls and standards documented, calibration procedures, complete documentation of all evidence examinations, documented training program with competency testing, technical review and monitoring the testimony of each of the analysts in the laboratory, comprehensive proficiency testing program. So there are many things that the laboratory needs to have in place to determine that they're ready for accreditation prior to submitting their application. The on-site inspection process begins with meeting with the administration of the organization. It's our desire to meet with the highest administrative level in that organization that would be interested and willing to talk to us about the process, make sure they understand what their organization is fixing to go through. Then we take a walking tour of the laboratory so that every member of the inspection team can get a picture of the layout of the laboratory. After the walking tour is completed, the next step is a fairly extensive review of documentation that was not provided with the application. There are documents such as individual case files for the analysts in the laboratory, proficiency testing records, validation studies, testimony monitoring, lots of other records that we ask to have available to the inspection team for review on site. And this generally consumes at least the first full day on site of reviewing those types of records. The inspection team in reviewing these has to verify that the laboratory is operating in accordance with this operational technical procedures, that the work that the analysts are doing is consistent with their training. We look at a minimum of 5 case files for each analyst. Say to make sure that their procedures are being followed, that they're properly documenting their work, and that their work that they are documenting is consistent with their defined procedure. We do a minimum of 5 cases per analyst.
They're losing.
We're having trouble.
Could you put the microphone a little closer and you might be able to. There we go.
I'm sorry. We say that we will review a minimum of 5 cases per annum. We often request additional cases for review, particularly if you have someone working in an area such as trace evidence where they may work on multiple sub-disciplines. We want to see examples of all of their work, and also if they're working in some areas where they infrequently do examinations, we particularly want to look at that work to see if that's properly documented as well. We make an attempt to interview every person in the laboratory, and this is always done after you review their work so that you can interview them in relation to the work that they do and have an understanding of their work, and you review their statements of qualifications, their training records and everything. So generally you know very much about these individuals before you conduct the interviews. And we train our inspectors that this is not an opportunity to go in there and cross-examine the individual, but to, in an appropriate way, determine that these individuals have been properly trained, they understand the work that they're doing. At the conclusion of the on-site inspection, there is a summation conference held with the laboratory director and other individuals selected by the laboratory director to give a report of the findings of the inspection team. The team captain for that inspection team summarizes the findings of the team and reviews each of the findings where non-compliance is being reported. We do not leave any documents with the laboratory because we have an audit process. In recent years, we've developed a process to make sure that we are inspecting consistently and fairly with all laboratories. That process is called an audit process, where a draft report is prepared by the inspection team based upon what they've reported to the laboratory. We send that report out to our staff inspectors who review it and give us feedback and ask questions on things that are not clear in the report. The audit committee suggestions are incorporated into the report. We obviously don't go in and change things, but we may find that a finding of non-compliance is reported by the inspection team on one criterion where actually it should have been scored on a different criterion in our program. It doesn't change anything except the basis for which the non-conformity is found. The inspection team captain prepares that audited report. The laboratory is advised in writing with that report that they have the opportunity to appeal. They're advised that they have 2 options. Number one, if they do not disagree with the findings that are reported, then they may begin the process of corrective actions. Or if they feel that there is something that's inappropriately reported as non-compliant, they include it to our board of directors, and they notify me, and I will place it on the agenda for the next meeting of the board.
Can you just address the process that takes place between the original inspection finding and the supplemental finding in your reports? So,
Actually, I'm in the midst of that now.
okay, great.
With the original finding, they get this audited report. If they want to appeal, they take it to the board. If the board agrees with their appeal, then they will receive another report called a board appeal review report. If the board doesn't agree, then they stay with the audited report. They're identified in the report those things that have to be fixed, that are non-compliances with the accreditation requirements, and they will then work with that inspection team captain in taking corrective actions. We often have to go back and revisit a laboratory to review things. On some occasions, we can receive documentation provided by the laboratory to the inspection team. They will review that, and when the inspection team is satisfied that they find that the laboratory is not in compliance, they will prepare a supplemental report. The supplemental report includes all the original findings, but it has a supplemental listing under that that says what the laboratory did to correct that finding of non-compliance. Generally, the supplemental report is a report that is used as the basis for the board to make an accreditation decision. because the supplemental report generally is not prepared until the appointed team believes that the laboratory is not compliant with all the essential requirements of the accreditation program. Now, I mentioned essential findings. In the Nassau Lab Accreditation Program, we have 3 levels of requirements. The essential ratings are assigned to the evaluation criteria for those standards which directly affect and have fundamental impact on the work product of the laboratory or the integrity of the evidence. Then we have another level, important ratings are assigned to the evaluation criteria for those standards which are considered to be key indicators of the overall quality of the laboratory but may not directly affect the work product or the integrity of the evidence. And thirdly, the desirable ratings are for those things that would make the laboratory a lot more, I guess, pleasing in a lot of ways, but are not really going to have an impact on the quality of the work itself. In order to be accredited, the laboratory must comply with 100% of the essential requirements, 75% of the important, and 50% of the desirable requirements. I'm going to review just some of the, real quick, some of the essential requirements that exist. We have a general category, really well understood procedures must exist for and preserve the integrity of evidence. Laboratory security, preparation, storage, security, disposition of case records and reports, control of materials and supplies, maintenance and calibration of equipment and instruments, and for operation of individual characteristic databases. We have quite a few standards related to evidence. A chain of custody record must be maintained, which provides a comprehensive documented history of each evidence transfer over which the laboratory has control. Each individual item of evidence must be marked for identification when practical. If the item does not lend itself to marking, its proximate container or identifying tag must be marked. Obviously, you can't very well mark white powder or paint chips or pairs of fibers and things like that. The proximate container has to be identified. Continuing with evidence, evidence seals must be designed and used to protect the integrity of the evidence. Procedural precautions must exist which reduce the risk of evidence loss, cross-transfer, contamination, or other deleterious change. The secure area for overnight and long-term storage of evidence must be available. We have requirements on the quality system. Every laboratory must have a documented quality manual. We specify 18 issues that must be included in that quality manual. The state has a laboratory to operate. The laboratory must have an individual designated as a quality manager. We have quite a few technical procedures. Procedures used must be generally accepted in the field, supported by data gathered and reported in a scientific manner. New technical procedures must be validated to prove their efficacy in examining evidence material before being implemented on casework. The laboratory must maintain written copies of appropriate technical procedures. Controls and standard samples must be used to document in the case record to ensure the validity of the testing parameters, thereby the conclusions. We have requirements on the documentation of examination. Examination documentation must be sufficiently detailed to support the conclusions. Another examiner who is knowledgeable in the area must be able to review that and determine what was done and be able to reach the same conclusion by documentation. Must be free of obliterations and erasures. Each page of examination documentation must bear a unique identifier and initials of the person who prepared that documentation. Written reports must be generated for all analytical work performed on evidence by the laboratory. Must contain the conclusions and opinions that address the purpose for which the analytical work was undertaken. The significance of associations made must be communicated clearly and qualified properly. The name of the author must appear in the report. This is a fairly new standard that came into the 2005 manual. We realized that we had a lot of requirements, but none that addressed the issuance of the reports. We now require the issuance of reports. And, when associations are made, they must be clear. This came about as a result of working with the laboratory that did heat comparisons, and we found in their reports they were saying the ink on this pen match the ink on this paper? Well, you don't have to be a genius to realize that when ink is manufactured, it's put in more than one pen. They make it in large quantities. So that ink on that paper could have been consistent with the ink from one pen, but also could be consistent with ink from every other pen that was filled from that batch of ink. So we've determined that whenever you make associations like that, you have to be clear as to what the difference of that association is in the report itself.
So, Mr. Keaton, I don't know how much longer you have to go, but I was wondering if we could kind of move it along, because I'd like to set aside a little time for questions.
Okay,
I'm sure the commissioners are going to have questions for you.
Okay, I'm essentially through. You've got review documentation, you've got corrective action.
You know, Rob, may I just stop you? The slide you just went through, I think, is an important one. If you wouldn't mind, I know if you could just touch on that one quickly about the technical review process, and then move the others along.
Okay.
Thank you.
It is essential that a representative portion of all the work done by each individual be subjected to technical review. We specify who can do a technical review. It has to be someone who is competent through training and experience who technically reviews the work of another analyst. We don't say how much, but a representative portion of their work. And the reason we don't require it all, we don't want to shift the responsibility of that work from the analyst to the reviewer. But we want to review a sufficient amount that we know that that person's work is routinely technically competent. We require 100% administrative review of all reports to make sure that we don't have incorrect names and dates and that sort of thing. We also require the monitoring of testimony of every analyst at least once a year, and feedback given to the analyst about testimony. This is also very important. We require a laboratory to have a procedure in writing whereby if they have an indication of a technical problem or a problem with the work of an analyst, they have a procedure whereby they take appropriate corrective actions, determine the nature of the problem, do what is necessary to correct that. We have personnel requirements for every discipline in which we offer accreditation. We have 3 forms of compliance monitoring. Annual accreditation reports are required from each laboratory, proficiency testing, and interim inspections. Annual reports are required from each laboratory based upon the standards of the accreditation program. We have a proficiency testing program where we have approved test providers. We actually go out and require our test providers to submit an application and have their facilities inspected as well, and make sure that they put out a quality proficiency test. All of the tests are reviewed by a proficiency review committee who are appointed individuals who are competent to review the test in each of the areas. These, of course, are external tests that every laboratory must participate in. Laboratories must have a proficiency testing program. They must participate in external testing. Each individual is required to take at least one proficiency test in each discipline in which they perform work on an annual basis. Interim inspections, whenever we determine that there is a reason to believe the laboratory is operating out of compliance with the accreditation program, and may have some problems, we have the right to go in and request an inspection of that laboratory. There are 3 forms of sanctions that can be imposed upon a laboratory: probation, suspension, and revocation. Probation for a specified time during which a laboratory must comply with specified requirements. Suspension means that a laboratory is not accredited for a period of time, but they must demonstrate that they have corrected the issue and they can have their accreditation restored without through the new application process. If accreditation is revoked, then they must apply and go through the process from step 1. I appreciate the opportunity to come and speak to you. I'd be glad to answer any questions you have.
Okay, thank you very much. And yes, we'll begin.
Thank you for the presentation. You did have a slide on personnel credentialing.
Yes.
Didn't have a chance to read that, but for director, you have minimum requirements for director of laboratories?
You know, actually for a director, the requirements are much more lenient than they are for an analyst, because there are many laboratories that have strictly administrators who are the directors of the laboratories. So even though we have requirements for education support, they are in the area of important rather than essential. If that director goes into the arena of analyzing evidence, then they have to meet the requirements of the practitioner or the examiner for that area in which they work. Then they would have to have a baccalaureate degree as a minimum.
I guess it's a question of reconciling them with the Forensic Commission's bylaws, where in fact the Commission does establish minimum qualifications for forensic lab directors. How is that then balanced by, in this case, ASCLAD's acceptance of a new director? Is there a review by the Commission or DCGS on the credentials of those nominated directors?
Well, it may be someone who's been on the commission longer. Dr. Willie may answer this better, but it's my understanding that the commission adopted essentially the standards and the criteria of the either ASCLAD lab or ABFT. So I guess we defer to their standard for that requirement.
Is there a particular bylaw that you are referencing, do you know, in terms of
Article 3,
qualifications?
Section 1, functions of the Commission.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's taken out of the legislation, out of 995 law.
We're having a little trouble hearing it, but it was my understanding that we adopted ASCLAD lab accreditation as a necessary but not sufficient criteria for our commission's accreditation, with the explicit understanding that we were free and in fact would, if appropriate, set criteria that were higher than ASCLAD lab.
But
If that's responsive.
Dan Willie, to answer John's question, in the history of this commission, we have never done so. We have never said that an ASCLAD lab director acceptable to ASCLAD lab was not acceptable to this commission.
That's correct, but we're free to do so. I don't think that's in dispute.
I would agree.
I agree. Any other questions?
Yes. Mr. Keaton, we see in your reports a reference to proficiency testing, and specifically, I think it's the question is the lab should conduct annual proficiency testing in each discipline using re-examination or blind techniques. Now, first of all, is that an essential, an important, or desire?
That is an important standard, one that we would love to see laboratories do, but it is not one that we keep them from being accredited.
All right, and could you define for us what you mean by re-examination and blind? I think I know, but I think it'd be better if you told us.
A blind test is one in which the person taking the test is not aware that they're being tested. In the proficiency test, it may be submitted through routine casework or in some other manner. Generally, in a forensic laboratory, about the only way to issue a blind test is to submit it as a case in which they think they're actually working on real evidence. A re-examination is one in which an examiner has analyzed the evidence, and at some point later, that evidence is re-examined by another analyst.
Now, we seem to be seeing in reports that we're getting today, and generally speaking, that that question seems to be answered routinely in our laboratories as a no, including the re-examination issue. How does that compare to laboratories across the country?
It probably is very comparable throughout the country. ASCLAD Lab, a couple of years ago, made a change in that requirement with the hope that it would encourage laboratories to do it more frequently. It used to be that in order to get a compliance on re-examination, there had to be re-examinations conducted in every discipline in which the laboratory does work. We now say in the manual if they do re-examinations in at least 50% of the disciplines in which they provide services, then they would be complying with the re-examination requirement. But it's still not being done by probably 50% of the laboratories.
And that is re-examinations that are not being done?
Re-examination or blind.
Or blind
They
testing?
can get a yes by either performing blind proficiency testing in at least 50% of their disciplines or re-examination in at least 50%.
So what is being done is a proficiency examination. What is required is a proficiency examination that the individual is aware of the fact that they're being tested.
Yes, that's correct.
Do you have, and incidentally, do you check to know if more than one analyst is looking at that proficiency test when they're doing them? You know what I mean?
No, we really do not have a way of verifying whether that's being done. We certainly, in the language of the accreditation manual, indicate to the laboratory that the appropriate way to take a proficiency test is to examine it exactly the same way that they would if it was actual evidence. And that means that if you routinely have a second person look at it in all of your evidence, then it would be okay in a proficiency test. But if you sometimes do that proficiency test alone, then do your evidence examinations alone, then you should do your proficiency tests alone.
Right. And
Dr. Wiley?
Two questions that have come up in the past. Recently added the forensic computer category to ASCID Lab. Could you describe how ASCID Lab goes about determining that a new category should be added and how they establish the criteria? And related to that then, since ASCID Lab requires a lab to have conducted casework in the area in which they're seeking accreditation, how is it that you expect the lab to have conducted such work before you've inspected them as to whether they're going to meet the criteria?
Okay, you've got two questions there. The one on adding a new discipline, I'll give you the example of digital and multimedia evidence. About 5 years ago, we were approached by people who were in the scientific community that do digital evidence analysis and wanted to know would we be interested in adding that as an accredited discipline. The answer given to them was that ASCID Lab did not have the expertise in that area. Our expertise was in accreditation, but if they would like to partner with us, provide the technical expertise to help develop the appropriate technical standards, we would work with them and include that in our accreditation program. So through a partnership, we did do that, and it has proved to be a good partnership because digital evidence is becoming a very common analytical procedure in many laboratories. We are going through that exact same process right now with adding breath alcohol calibration accreditation. A group called IAC that is involved with breath alcohol testing has asked us to consider accrediting that. So we have partnered with them, and in the very near future, a proposal to offer accreditation and calibration laboratories will be presented to the Delegate Assembly, and it is not without the expertise of the people who work in that area.
And the question about laboratories being expected to have performed casework before they've been reviewed as to whether they meet the expected criteria.
We have a special provision that was put in 2005 manual because of that very issue with two things. Number one, places like New York and Texas that require laboratories to be accredited prior to being doing work, and also DNA legislation that required laboratories to be accredited after October of 2006 in order to be able to enter their data into the database. So we have special provisions that for laboratories in those situations, they may apply for a special one-year accreditation using mock evidence. The inspection would be exactly the same, except that they would have to do their work on mock evidence provided by someone outside of their laboratory. We would come in and inspect them and 9 months later, they must apply for full accreditation based upon the examination of regular evidence.
Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, Mr. Keaton, I just want to ask you a question about the essentials. Typically, I guess most of the labs you work with they're mostly disciplined, and when the inspections are going forward, as we've been led to believe, it's sort of like a collaborative effort. There's discussion going back and forth. Is that correct?
Well, discussion back and forth goes in the form of, it is our practice that we don't, on Friday morning, surprise the host laboratory with a series of 20 findings. It is our practice to inform the laboratory director throughout the week when we're finding issues of non-compliance. We're not doing a lot of dialogue other than that.
Okay. Now, if a particular lab has a function which is performing at a level that there are essentials which are not being met, then that single discipline could actually cause a problem for the entire lab and all the rest of the disciplines. Is that right?
That is correct. One examiner in a 200-person laboratory can keep that lab from being accredited.
Gotcha. So in other words, if I've got a discipline which is not going to meet the essentials and I withdraw that discipline from the accreditation process, my lab could go forward without that particular discipline and be evaluated. Is that right?
You cannot withdraw it from the application unless you're going to discontinue doing that work altogether. As I said,
Okay.
Our accreditation program requires you to be accredited in all disciplines if you're doing work in those areas.
Gotcha. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Just once again, I'd like to express concern.
Dr. Jennings. Okay.
Comment was made last meeting to the the practice of allowing laboratories to, for up to 25% of the important requirements to support substandard practices, to me is a real concern. And I do question why you don't require corrective action for the important requirements.
Well, first off, they're not essential requirements because they have been determined to not impact the quality of that laboratory's work to the point that we would not accredit them. Now, I can tell you it has been addressed in the international program and that we don't have important and desirable criteria. Everything in the international program has to be satisfied in order to be accredited. Now, we do have what we call level 1 and level 2 requirements, which is somewhat the same. Some of the things that were important and desirable in the legacy program become level 2s. A level 1 non-conformance in the international program means that the laboratory has to fix that before they will receive accreditation. If it is a level 2 non-conformance, then they will be given until the first surveillance visit to have that fixed. And that will be one of the specific things that will be looked at on the first surveillance visit. But a lot of the desirable and important requirements in the legacy program don't exist in the international program because they have not been deemed to have that kind of impact on the quality of the laboratory's work.
Is the, on the proficiency testing, is the requirement of at least re-examination part of the legacy or international program?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch what you said.
Is the requirement that laboratories at least do re-examination, if not blind testing and proficiencies, part of the legacy or international program?
Well, it is a part of the legacy program. In the international program, it is not a requirement.
Okay.
One additional question.
On your slide, you stated that an important element of your survey practice is to verify that lab practices are in fact consistent with their operational and technical procedures. Is there an evaluation of the laboratory's technical procedures for their scientific defensibility? It's difficult, for instance, in validation. You do have a requirement that methods be validated, but the documents that are provided, there's no indication of minimum requirements in validation designs or minimum requirements for the design of quality control. How are those assessments made? Is a baseline established by your program for technical procedure?
Well, we rely upon the technical competence of individuals who do the inspections who are experts in that area. Just as in any profession, you would have to rely upon the experts in that profession to make that assessment. But if there is a procedure used by a laboratory that's not a well understood procedure within the community, then we would expect that laboratory to show us validation, work on that procedure before they report the case.
All right, thank you very much for coming here and for reviewing the program for us, and we appreciate the work that you do for New York State. We'll be giving you more work, I'm sure, in the future. I'd next like to turn to the laboratory accreditation items, and to begin this discussion with Dr. Willie's discussion about how we proceed once we are webcast. Perhaps the best way in terms of time constraints would be for us to prepare a proposal for the next meeting and ask Gina Bianchi to review the requirements under the Open Meetings Law for going into executive session. And if anyone on the commission has any thoughts or ideas about that, if you could provide them to me, we certainly will have an open discussion about it next time. But if you have thoughts about procedures to be implemented, if you would get them to me, I can get something back to you about proposed procedures. But essentially, we are going to have a procedure that we can implement to go into executive session to discuss matters of a sensitive nature once our meetings are webcast. And so we will put that on the agenda. We'll address it before we get into the laboratory accreditation items. But for today, since we are not webcast, I think we can proceed with our usual format. And if anyone does believe we need to go into executive session, you can indicate that to me. We will, as we decided last time, take these items one by one, the laboratory accreditation items, so that we can have a discussion on each one of them before asking the commission to vote on their accreditation. The first, we have 3 items today for accreditation. The first is the Westchester County Department of Public Safety Crime Lab. Do we have Michael Dowd here? You are here, I'm sorry. So we have the lab director here as well. If there are any questions, you do have the report from FLab Labs recommending accreditation. And is there any discussion regarding the Westchester County Public Safety Crime Lab accreditation, reaccreditation?
The only question I had was with respect to the personnel who don't have the academic credentials. What I'm assuming is that we have some experienced, seasoned people, but we have a lot of confidence in, but they just don't have the degrees that would comport with Accreditation Labs standards, but we feel confident in them and we're kind of grandfathering them along. Is that right?
Well, that may be a question. I think it goes to the question that was asked to Dr. Keaton before, but what weight goes to the fact that individuals at the lab do not possess the baccalaureate degree that is required for that position. So if you turn to page 24 of the report, there are several findings, one with respect to the lab director's experience and a degree, and the others with the firearms tool mark examiners and the late print examiners. And there are findings that they do not possess baccalaureate degrees or forensic science experience. Can you just address for us, Mr. Keaton, first of all, the frequency of those kind of findings in your accreditation reports, and what standard you use in deciding to accredit a lab, even if they may not meet these particular kind of formal education requirements?
Well, if you will note beside the requirement 211 that you're referring to, the wrong one, that's 212, that is a desirable requirement. And we do not give them a buy on that. We give them a non-compliance. But obviously they satisfy the requisite number of desirable requirements haven't been met. Again, Asclad Lab, from its very beginning, has felt that a manager can manage a laboratory if they have personnel who will make the scientific decisions, even if they don't have that background themselves.
Okay. And also with respect to the college degree, essentially, for some of the examiners in, firearms, latent print examiners, I understand it's fairly common in labs that many seasoned examiners who essentially learn the field by experience and by competency testing within the field of expertise often do not have a college degree.
The history of that is that in the initial program, that was a desirable requirement. It's hard to use the word requirement when it's a desirable standard. That was about 10 years ago elevated to an important. It is my expectation that in the next few years, it will be put out for vote to elevate it to an essential requirement for those practitioners in those disciplines of firearms, tool marks, QD, and latent print. But at the time the accreditation program came about, if you had made that an essential requirement, you probably wouldn't have accredited one laboratory in the United States.
Well, so it's grandfather, grandparent.
There is, and we have not gone that right, but I do think you'll see us going the right of elevating it to an essential in the near future.
I have a question about this Westchester application. Perhaps it could be directed to the laboratory director. But, I would note in passing that there's a lot of history here that I could go through with Mr. Keaton. I sat on a commission many years ago with Dr. Ganslin and Joe Peterson, where we looked at the whole issue of blind proficiency testing. And even though I felt, and others on the commission felt, that it could be done, and it could particularly be done for prints without much difficulty, or even ballistics, but let's just put that aside. I'd like to emphasize the notion here that commission recommended, and I think Mr. Keaton is telling us that 50% of the laboratories in the countries do at least re-examination of their work. Go back and look at some examiners' past work to make sure that their results were right. I would also point out that in the city of New York, we have two instances, one dealing with ballistics and the other dealing with fingerprints, where when a re-examination occurred because of problems in cases, we wound up going back and looking at least in one instance, hundreds of cases. So it would be my proposal, and I would wonder if the Westchester people would even object, that provisional to their accreditation, they should institute at the very least a re-examination program for all these disciplines going forward. That certainly would be the condition of my vote. And I would commend to my colleagues on the commission that taking a look at the New York City examples and the fact that at least 50% of labs do it, and it's done now in the legacy program, that might be a good idea.
Yes, Dr. Welly.
In the context of proficiency testing performed by re-examination of a previously examined specimen in the lab, the purpose is not to check up on the work of the first examiner. The purpose is to accept the first examiner's work as the answer, and you're simply testing the second person against the first. Now, when a discrepancy is identified, you might have to get to the root cause, but I would just clarify that re-examination is not a regular means of checking casework of analysts. It's a regular means of checking competency prospectively of the second examiner.
I agree with that. I would like to see it done independently, and I'd like to have real blind proficiency testing. But, we're not in that position. And it is, again, no substitute for good supervision, which is a separate and distinct question. But I'm just pointing out, can't we at least have a pledge or an agreement by the Westchester lab that at the very least They'll do re-examination and/or blind proficiency testing. But I understand the blind what makes people break out in rashes. But this re-examination, frankly, is a minimal requirement, and it should be done independently. But at the very least, can't we have that?
Well, I guess my response would be that I have a problem with imposing a new standard on one particular lab that isn't a standard that's been adopted for every lab by the commission, number one. And number two, I think it takes a lot of thought and discussion if we are adopting a standard that is different from the standard that is adopted for the profession by SCLAD Labs. That may be something we want to do. We know it's in our authority to do, but it seems to me that it's something that we have to do in a very careful and thoughtful manner.
Well,
does anyone else have an opinion?
Can we hear from the lab director what the thoughts are?
Well, I've just taken over the lab. The purpose of this meeting, I thought, was to approve our accreditation that's been applied for previously. My predecessor, since my immediate left, Lieutenant Mike Sinrich, who worked hard with, ran the lab for a number of years to get us to this point. I don't feel ready to commit to the accepting of the new standard just yet. I have to research that and spend quite a bit of time considering.
I'm not sure I've heard that.
I think they've already got the standards that we had set for them when they underwent this process in the first time. We should propose something we want.
Perhaps we could have agreed to put on the agenda for a future meeting discussion of whether the commission would like to impose as an, in addition to ASCOT Lab or any other accreditation, an expectation that laboratories perform at least re-examination. But I think we would have to have a fully developed proposal as to what that means, what its purpose is, how we would expect labs to conduct it, how are those results going to be reported and to whom, who's going to determine whether that's, or is it just a yes box, I did it. So for a future agenda item, I would agree we should discuss it, but I think it has to be for a future meeting.
We have Mr. Keaton here. There must be a reason that you asked that question and that 50% of labs you're telling us have it. How hard is that to do, Mr. Keaton, to have a re-examination? Do you have a template? Does anybody do this? And you're saying 50% of labs do it. How hard is it?
It is a variable depending upon the discipline you're talking about. If you're talking about controlled substance analysis, re-examination is much easier than it is in a case involving a limited amount of body fluid, where you may want to have evidence available for a third party to examine the evidence at some time later. There are many factors that come into play that are not readily apparent as to why laboratories don't do this as a routine practice.
But let me just ask you, we're talking here about fingerprints and ballistics. Those are not destructive tests. How hard would it be to have an independent re-examination of fingerprints or ballistics?
You pointed out something that's much easier to do. However, when you're talking about a re-examination, you're not talking about a verification. You're talking about starting from the beginning to recover the latent prints and then examine them. If you just want to examine the latent print, that's very easy. If you just want to examine the projectile, it's very easy. But recovering...
That's all. I'm not talking about crime scene here.
At this point, if I could interject, at this point, there is an agenda item which recommends that we accredit the Westchester County Department of Public Safety Crime Lab based on the ASCLAD Lab reaccreditation report. And I'd like to put that to a vote and ask if there is a motion to do that. Motion by the superintendent. If there is a second to the motion. Second. All in favor, please indicate. Any opposition?
Well, I will vote no, but I do have an amendment. I would vote for accrediting them if the laboratory director would agree to do re-examination for latent prints, not the lifting of prints, and ballistics, in accordance with, in conjunction with ASCLD lab. If 50% of the labs do it, I'm sure ASCLD can help them in the supplement, in the next inspection to do it. So I'd ask, I would move for their accreditation pending a promise from the new head of the lab that for those two disciplines, just for the examination of latent prints and ballistics, he would agree with the cooperation of ASCLD lab to do a re-examination.
All right, well, the motion to accredit the lab was carried with one objection to the motion. And I think that renders your motion moot. But there is a proposal that we put on the agenda, the item of whether the commission should require a higher standard of re-examination in testing in order to qualify for accreditation, and that we should look for someone to present to us on that issue and consider it at our next commission meeting. And is all in favor of adding that item to the agenda, please indicate by saying aye. Is anyone opposed to it? Okay, so we'll add that item to our agenda for the next meeting.
Perhaps as a good way to start that, because I do agree that the template for doing re-examination will be different by every discipline and to some extent by the size and complexity of the lab, that perhaps if staff of the Forensic Science Office were to review the accreditation documents for our New York State labs and find out how many of them say they already do re-examination, and ask those labs if they could share their current procedure for re-examination in the disciplines, we would have a very good base on which to discuss what's involved and what we're really asking the labs to do.
Okay. Is there any opposition to trying to essentially survey the labs? Whether we can get that done and completed, we'll certainly make an effort in order to try to do that.
Because I don't think ASCLD lab provides a template to tell a lab how to go about doing it. They leave it to the lab. So unfortunately, we don't have a central repository, so we're going to have to go to the individual labs, I think.
Could we also maybe rely on the judgment of Director Dow, who maybe hasn't had his office painted yet, to maybe look into that on his own, which he might. I just asked Barry might want to reconsider his vote there, because I just don't think it's fair to change the rules on him.
But
I don't disagree with what you said. I think, I think it's, especially considering what some of the things we're going to be looking at later today, that it might be something that Director Dow might want to look into. But I would rely on his expertise and judgment in doing that.
Well, just for the record, Mr. Dad, I don't mean to pick on you at all, right? But I think this is a very serious issue. I don't think we paid enough attention to it. I think we've seen a lot of failed proficiency tests, and I am voting no only for symbolic reasons, okay? Not anything personal to you. And I agree that in some ways it's unfair, but if I don't start saying these things and if we don't start pushing, it's not going to happen. I can see that. And I think these other matters are very serious. Now, when it comes to latent prints and ballistics, believe me, it's simply not hard. I wished he said yes, but I don't blame him. He just got there.
If you don't mind, let's just hear from the lab briefly, and then I'd like to move on, because we do have many important issues to discuss today.
This is Mike Sinderchuk, the outgoing laboratory director, and I know we've had a lot of discussions prior to this as part of the remediation process. I just want to clarify that when you're talking about failed proficiency tests, to what laboratory are you referring?
What am I referring?
Which laboratory are you referring?
I don't have them here, but we've seen quite a few proficiency tests where there were simply wrong results in labs that have been accredited.
But the vote, as I understand it on the floor, is for the accreditation of the Westchester County Department of Public Safety Crime Lab. I don't know if this is exactly the time in the meeting, and I believe me, if there's an issue with proficiency tests, absolutely it should be discussed. But the vote on the floor is for our reaccreditation from the committee. I don't know if this is exactly the position to make that statement that we need to look into this further, because it doesn't apply specifically and directly to our lab, because we
Well,
haven't
I
had
think you
it.
made the point, and I don't think the comment was directed at any particular lab or necessarily any New York State lab. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, look, I'll call Vince Crispino or the other commissioners. We have seen over the last 10 years many proficiency tests where labs got the wrong answers and they were nonetheless accredited by ASCLD. I mean, that's
All
just
right,
true.
I think it's time
That's all
to
I'm
end
saying.
the
I'm not
discussion,
directing it at Westchester.
if you don't mind, so we can move forward.
I have no
The
objection.
comments are not directed at the Westchester Public Safety Lab, I think, for clarification. The next item on the agenda is the Nassau County Office of Medical Examiner Toxicology Lab. Again, ASCLD Lab has recommended accreditation. You have a copy of the report. Is there any discussion about the Nassau County accreditation?
For the last time we spoke.
You are in New York, correct?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
I'm just wondering about, there was a lot of discussion about the health and safety issues, and apparently they've not been addressed. Now, I know it's not an essential and it's not going to stop accreditation, but I'm wondering whether or not we can get some sort of insight as to why this has not been taken care of, since particularly in the toxicology lab, health and safety and management issues are extremely important. So I guess I would like to know what's the problem here.
The person who was our health and safety officer left with extremely short notice, as in 2 days' notice. We scrambled to put together, to get another health and safety officer, to put something together in time for our interim inspection. It didn't happen in time. We are continuing to work on the health and safety program. We have a building-wide, a department-wide health and safety officer in place now. We are forming a health and safety committee, and hopefully in time for our next inspection in 2008, we will have a fully compliant health and safety program.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay, any other discussions? Could I have a motion to approve the accreditation for Nassau County Office of the Medical Examiner Toxicology Lab? I'm sorry,
I'll
there
make
was
that
a
motion. I'll make a motion to approve.
Okay, thank you. Second? Dr. Wiley? All in favor? Aye. Anyone opposed? Okay, the accreditation is approved.
Only to comment on exactly that conversation about the specific element of the expensive, I would use it more. As would the discussion with Dr. Dowd.
Okay, thank you. The third item is accreditation of the Nassau County Police Department Forensic Evidence Bureau. We do, again, have a report from ASCLD Labs recommending reaccreditation in controlled substances, firearms, camera, collecting documents, toxicology, blood, alcohol only, trace evidence, and latent prints. Is there any discussion about Nassau County Police Department Forensic Evidence Bureau accreditation?
At this point, I would move for executive session if we were following those rules, because I want to ask, why has serology, biology, and hair analysis been deleted?
Okay, and let me just back up. Do we have Detective Lieutenant Grinnell
Yes, right.
here with us? Okay.
These questions were answered in the meeting back in November, or end of November, beginning of December. Basically, serology was removed because we now have all our serology and DNA we can done at the medical examiner's office, forensic genetics. Our hair has been removed. We are in the process of revising the protocols and retraining the analysts, the hair analysts.
What happened to all the cases you had done prior with the analyst you've now removed?
They've been, cases for the past 2 years have been reviewed, and those results were submitted to ASCLD Lab.
Okay, Dr. Jenny?
Comment made under proficiency test records in this report. It stated that 3 proficiency tests had different conclusions than the consensus results.
Where are you reading from?
I'm reading from proficiency test records, paragraph 3. So the lab findings were not in agreement with the consensus results of other lab participants. So there's really no description as to, excuse me, there's no description as to the nature of the
Two
error.
of them were late fingerprint smudges that we are not able to make a determination. The consensus was able to make a determination, but we're not able to.
We can't hear, we really need to hear this.
Okay, could you,
I'm sorry.
do you want to stand? Maybe we can get you closer to a microphone here, if you wouldn't mind. Okay.
Two of those proficiency tests were in late fingerprint examinations. And in each of them, we received a smudged copy. Whether it's, I'm not exactly sure how it was smudged, but it was smudged, and we were not able to make a determination. They are under, right now we're basically going back and forth with the PRC on that.
So you did arrive at conclusions in reporting your...
We were not able to identify on that smudge. And basically the consensus identified a fingerprint.
All right, so you reported unable to identify.
Correct.
And the other was firearms.
They're in the firearms. I'm not familiar with firearms problems.
Three tests had different conclusions.
I'm sorry, sir.
The report says three teams had different conclusions. You just mentioned 2, maybe 3.
Firearms.
No PRC letter received, and I'm sorry, I'd have to find out about it and get back to you. I wasn't familiar with the firearms.
What's happening with hair analysis in Nassau County then, right now?
Right now, it's not being done. If it needs to be done, we'd have to request that it be outsourced.
Okay.
Okay, is there any other discussion? Can I have a motion to approve the accreditation of the Nassau County Police Department Forensic Evidence Bureau?
Motion.
Superintendent Felton, second.
Second.
John Hicks, all in favor? Signal by saying aye. Aye. Any opposition? Yeah, oh, there is an option to abstain. A number of abstentions?
I am concerned about
Dr. Jenny abstains. Any other abstentions? Okay, the accreditation is approved. Thank you very much for answering our questions. And I do want to go back to one item. My counsel advised me that I did not entertain a motion on the bylaws just to change the technical numbering of articles of the bylaws. The third item of the bylaw changes. Could I have a motion to correct the numbering of the articles in the bylaws? Okay, thank you, Dr. West. All right, all in favor? Any opposition? Thank you very much. I'm moving to the next item on the agenda, which is laboratory disclosure guidelines and the Office of the Inspector General. We did discuss at our last meeting that we had made the determination to ask the Inspector General to serve as the independent investigative body to receive allegations of serious misconduct or negligence under Coverdale The the Inspector General did accept that assignment. All of the lab directors here should have received a letter from the Inspector General's office advising them of the change and the fact that they are accepting that responsibility. We'll get very shortly to a matter which I referred to the Inspector General. It's the first item that was referred to the Inspector General instead of the temporary commission on investigations, which have been serving in that capacity previously. The temporary committee on investigations had three matters referred from the commission, and we'll get to that very shortly. They've reported on one. We have a report today, and we still have a third item that is available to them. I have heard from Barry Scheck that he would appreciate having the Inspector General come to our meeting. I think that's a very good idea. I will invite her to come to our next meeting to talk about the Inspector General's office and their procedures for conducting investigations. They also have an outreach effort ongoing throughout the state government to alert state government in general about them and to encourage referrals, and they intend to do similar outreach at the labs. I think they indicated in their letter ways that individuals at the labs can contact them. They also made an offer to do training at particular labs if you'd like the Inspector General to come out to your lab to do that. So I wanted to make you aware of the procedures regarding the Inspector General. And let me just stop very briefly. Oh, okay, thanks. Is there any other discussion about the Inspector General's office in general taking over that responsibility? Right, thank you. The next item on our agenda is an update on the Hostler matter that we discussed at the last commission meeting. I've asked Inspector Zioski from the State Police Lab to speak to us about that matter, independent of the issue that we were discussing about Dr. Reno's lab. I think there was a recognition on the part of the commissioners that there could be potential evidence that remained available that could be very important in an ongoing investigation of that case. So, Inspector, can I turn it over to you, please?
Thank you. This is going to be a summary and the evidence involved in the mentioned update. This event happened back in May of 2003, where hospital was found hanging.
We can't hear you.
Can't hear you. You got to get to a microphone.
Now, can you hear me now?
Not really.
Would you mind sitting at our table?
You took one of these up there. For that.
Thanks.
Thank you. How's that work? Is that better?
Yep.
Yeah, that's better.
Thank you. This event was back in May of 2003, where Hostler was found hung in her cell at Albion Correctional. That's the point when the state police initiated an investigation. The following day, May 13th, an autopsy was conducted by the Monroe County Medical Examiner's Office where an acid phosphatase test was positive on one vaginal swab. The following day, Monroe County determines oral, rectal, and vaginal slides were negative for sperm. The following day, Erie County Central Police Services receives items from the Hostler investigation. Erie County reported semen was identified on one rectal swab. No sperm was found. It's my understanding that a PSA test was conducted on that item. And no semen was found on the underpants or shorts. The rectal swabs were sent to Orchid Cellmark for YSTR analysis, which makes sense because no sperm was available for analysis. And Orchid Cellmark reports that no YSDRs were found on the rectal swabs. Again, those swabs were found positive by Erie County lab. In March of 2004, all the items were destroyed on that case, except for materials that were found in Erie County Police Services and Monroe County. In particular, Monroe County items were collected and sent to LabCorp on June 5th of 2007 with the intentions of having YSDR analysis done on the rectal and vaginal swabs that was in the enemy's possession. So that's the latest update. We had no analysis or results on those analyses as of now.
Could I just make a correction, Jerry?
Sure.
You want to this, Dr. Bina?
So we don't get back into the swab slide issue. What was collected and had been preserved at the medical examiner's office were the smears that were originally evaluated for sperm. We had had one set of swabs at our office that were consumed in the testing and retest to verify our original analysis.
I said swabs? I meant slides. I stand corrected.
And didn't you also find that there was positive for the presence of semen on both, on the vaginal swabs, it was strongly positive, but you also got a weak positive on the rectals?
Who's your question directed to, Barry?
Yeah.
When I was listening to the presentation, my recollection of the evidence was just slightly different. That originally the medical examiner got a strong positive on the vaginals and a weak positive on the rectals.
There was a strong positive screen on the swab for the vaginal, on one of the vaginal, and Erie County got the positive semen on the rectal swabs. They were submitted.
Do you agree with that, Dr. Bina?
Let me see if I have the original report, which I should. Hang on one second.
Okay, and just Inspector, so the state police lab sent those slides
Yes, the slides.
to an independent lab?
Yes, because we do not conduct YSDRs at our lab, so LabCorp does, so we sent it there. Keep in mind, no sperm was found on these items, so it would be pointless to try to, with a limited amount of sample, to try to attempt an SDR and then a YSDR. It would be more logical.
Okay, and do you know anything about the time frame when you expect to receive your report?
Well, we gave it an expedited status, hopefully by the end of this month. I'm hoping.
Could I make one friendly suggestion that it might you might consider in this case a photomicrograph of the slides to document the absence of the sperm? I know that's not generally done, but for this purpose it might be a very good idea.
If LabCorp has attempted to remove biological material for YSTR amplification, those slides are no longer, a photomicrograph won't show you anything because they've now been wiped.
That's why I'm
They're already gone. They already went to LabCorp.
Yeah, they have the capacity to do that.
But if they've already wiped off the specimen, there's not going to be anything on the slide.
Well, the suggestion is made, so the request, if it's appropriate, could be forwarded to them if they haven't already, the evidence already has been consumed or destroyed.
We can ask, you make a good point, it's probably well on its way, but again, you're photographing every micron of that slide to show nothing's there.
That would not be technically difficult. LabCorp has a cytogenetics laboratory. They have the capacity to make a photomicrograph of the slide.
Okay.
Yes, and I'm pointing this out. Frankly, this kind of thing should generally be done, but it has particular significance in this case because we have the report that there's suspicion that there's a correction officer with a vasectomy that was suspected in rapes, and that was the original report. And frankly, everything that you can do to document the absence of sperm on the slides is of important significance to a potential investigation. So that's why I suggested.
I just want to point out, we do have 2 labs that say that already, so, but I can ask LabCorp, it's not too late.
I'm just thinking about the best documentation and presentation of the evidence. I realize it's not ordinarily done, but it makes sense here.
And I think it's important to state for the record that we don't do investigations here in the commission, and I think we asked that this matter be addressed because it came to us, and we were all concerned about just what Barry Scheck was saying, that there could be possible leads in a criminal investigation where this evidence is still very important. So I appreciate the state police following up on it. Thank you. And Dr. Bino, you brought it to our attention, and we appreciate that as well.
If I can then now answer Mary's question. Yes, the original report, we had a very strong positive reaction on the vaginal swab, and we had a weak reaction on the rectal and oral. That is not uncommon. Traces of blood or fecal material can give a weak positive reaction in that particular phenyl phosphate test. And routinely, we would not, if we had a weak positive reaction, consider that to be significant or something that we would indicate to us that it needed further testing.
Thank you. I recognize that we're not in the business of doing investigations, but it's hard to overlook the fact that we're talking about an incident which took place in May of 2003, and it's still ongoing. And I do recall, Dr. Benno, from your prior report, which we thankfully got a hold of at the last meeting by virtue of your being there and having it available to us. But you indicated in your at least in your oral testimony, if not your report, which I haven't committed to memory, that there was other evidence of foul play with respect that you found. Is that memory correct?
No, I don't know specifically what you're referring to. No, I mean, basically, I simply talked about the fact that we did find that strong positive reaction. We retested the leachate with the phenyl phosphate method using our quality control supervisor as the analyst. It tested the same. And then we brought in the reagents for the grantamine loop procedure that was used in Erie County and retested the leachate once again with multiple positive and negative controls. All of the controls tested correctly, and the leachate tested positive by that procedure as well. But there wasn't other evidence other than I had brought up the issues that we were aware at the time that there were some investigations ongoing at Albion Correctional Facility regarding alleged rapes of inmates, and that there was some question about a guard who was azoospermic.
Well, again, I had thought that part of this update might be some insight as to what is going on at Albion. Not just the scientific follow-up, which the state police are commendably going forward with. I guess we're not going to get that today, but this is an institution which has got a history of sexual abuse involving inmates, some of it quite notorious, and it just keeps coming up and up and up. I certainly commend the state police for going forward with this investigation and hope that they get a speedy result, because frankly, it's a concern to me that there's an ongoing investigation. A young woman has taken her own life under difficult circumstances, and it's now 4 years down the road, and I don't know that anything's happened at Albion, or whether or not they're even being consulted or updated with respect to the outcome of what we're talking about today.
Well, I think that the commissioners shared their concern, but I also think, quite frankly, it doesn't fall within our responsibility or oversight capability here to investigate Albion Correctional Facility. So I think it's important that the state police has heard the issues being raised at the commission, and I know that they're following through with the issues that have been raised here. So I don't think there's anything else we can do further in the investigation other than to make sure that this evidence is safeguarded and that it is properly analyzed by a laboratory.
Yes. For the benefit of some of the new members of the commission, to make the point that these outside independent laboratories that are being sent these specimens are regulated laboratory entities. They are regulated by the Department of Health under the category of forensic identity.
Thank you. The next item on our agenda is a report that we did receive from the New York State Temporary Commission of Investigation on a matter that was referred to them by the Commission regarding an NYPD fingerprint technician. We did ask the investigator to come and attend our meeting today. We thought that someone was going to attend, but apparently that's not the case. We do have the report of the SIC. I can't answer any questions that you might have about the report, so if there are questions, we may have to defer this and again ask that someone from the Commission come to answer any questions in the report. But the report basically does indicate that the investigation was completed. The report is now on the SIC website. It found that corrective actions have been taken by the NYPD Police Department. And if there is no further discussion about the report, I think this is an item that we could close out from the point of view of the Commission's oversight of this matter.
Actually, I have a few. It's a shame that the people from the state are not here to answer questions. I have quite a few. First, I would note in passing, it doesn't appear, and I don't know if they did, consult with any independent expert in the area of fingerprints or laboratory management of fingerprint in order to evaluate this whole matter. I was wondering if we could get a list of the cases involved here in terms of which ones, certainly at the very least, were the convictions. I don't know if that is available, but the convictions that were reviewed. I'd be curious to know whether any defense lawyer anywhere was ever notified in any of these cases about the problems. I'm very concerned that there is no specific discussion here of the supervisors that missed these latents, and what explanations, if any, did the supervisors give for not being able to identify these instances where Phyllis Martin failed to identify the fingerprints at issue. I'm quite concerned that this is not. I would thoroughly expect that the reports that we get from the Inspector General's office will be far more detailed with respect to this kind of matter.
Well, I do think we have to make a distinction between having an outside independent body conduct an investigation and then have the Commission review all aspects of that investigation. If there are questions about whether they did a satisfactory job at their investigation, that is certainly something that we may want to look into. But I don't think we can expect a repeat of the investigation and steps that they took during the investigation for the Commission.
But,
a list of the cases, that sort of thing is the kind of detail that I think is beyond what our mission and our job is here on the Commission.
I do agree, Barry. I do agree with you in that the Commission, in reviewing these cases, may have questions of its own. I wonder if it couldn't be part of this Commission's report to ask the questions of the Commission as to what concerns should be addressed in its own investigation. so that as it goes about, developing this plan of action, preparing its report, it takes into consideration the issues that have been raised by this commission.
So do it really up front when we're referring the matter, say, we have these questions and would like you to consider them in your investigation. I think that's a very good suggestion. Our ability to do it. So I guess there's two issues. First of all, should we defer this until we can have the SIC come and respond, or is the majority of the commission satisfied with the report and willing to accept it? I guess at this point I could ask, the lab director is here from the NYPD lab, and ask if you would feel comfortable addressing issues with respect to the report.
Sure.
Okay, would you come up here, please, to the microphone? Let's see if we may be able to resolve this in terms of how it was dealt with and what the lab did as a result of the case. So could you just give us just a brief summary of the matter?
Well, as you know, the incident came to light as a result of a analysis being done for a second time on a particular firearm, unknown to the second examiner that had been previously examined by another examiner. This was picked up during the reporting stage by the person preparing the report, brought it to the supervisor of the section, and then a corrective action ensued. As a result of that, a lengthy corrective action took place over the course of 13 months to 18 months. And we reviewed approximately 132 cases. We came across 26 cases which were deficient. This was eventually reported to ASCI Lab. It should be noted that this particular discipline was not an accreditable discipline by ASCI Lab at the time that this took place. It subsequently did become an accreditable discipline, and for which this commission granted us accreditation, as well as ASCI Lab at subsequent inspection. This was internally reviewed by the Legal Bureau and the what is known as the CIRD, which is a resource division in the Detective Bureau, for the matter that we're discussing in terms of convictions versus guilty pleas. I don't have that data available to me. I'm sure we could get all of it and possibly provide it to the commission if deemed appropriate.
Now, I think it's important that we consider the dates involved, because quite a bit has taken place since this case and another case that we're going to consider today has occurred with respect to the NYPD and the notification of the district attorney's offices. And the SIC report is critical of the time that occurred before the lab reported the DAs to the DAs that there was a problem with this particular examiner. We were aware that there were issues with respect to when the labs notified district attorneys, and although it preceded my time on the commission has had discussions about that led to Commissioner Fitzpatrick's meetings and the DA Association meetings with the lab directors to formulate a policy. We adopted a policy now in the commission that has gone to all the labs to really address this issue of prompt notification of the district attorneys and when that notification is required. But this action that we've taken occurred well after this particular incident in the NYPD lab. So we have moved forward considerably in this whole area of when labs need to make notification to the DA's offices. And I hope that I know we've given very clear guidance on that issue, and I'm hoping that we're not going to see these instances occur in the future. But I think in many respects this is water over the dam, because this occurred, quite a bit before those procedures taking place.
I think that's correct. I just wanted to ask for a clarification. Did I hear the director say that where a guilty plea had taken place in a case, there was a decision that there was no need to look at the findings of Officer Martin?
That was a evaluation that was determined by our legal bureau.
Okay.
Now we didn't. After the district attorney's offices were notified, we have been waiting for responses from their offices on what cases they think, based on the disposition, what cases need to be re-examined. Because if you look at the body of work for Phyllis Martin, there's 1,400 cases. That would take us approximately 5 years to re-examine. The
well, it wouldn't take
limitations required us to make examinations on select cases, and that's how we based it.
I understand.
I'm sorry. Just let me finish for 1 second. Since that took place, we have looked at 12 additional requests with, as I recall, no deficiencies noted.
You know, I think it's very important that those decisions be decisions that are made by the district attorneys and not the lab directors. We've addressed this as a commission by giving guidance to the lab directors about when they're supposed to notify the district attorneys. I think the decision and the list of cases that are affected and responsibilities to notify the defense bar are issues that then need to be handled by the district attorney's office.
We received no directive to look into those cases. I certainly would like to table consideration of this report until we get a better idea of how it was put together, rather than vote to accept it. So I would move to table consideration of this report until such time as a member of the investigation commission comes forward and can answer some of the questions that we've been proposing. And it might be helpful in terms of future investigations and in setting up a template for them.
Well,
I would echo that.
But we don't vote to accept or reject. This is an independent body and panel to make an investigation. They've made it. They've made it available publicly on their webpage. It's done. We don't get to say we don't like it.
Well, here's my request. We ask that somebody come here and report. Our entity designated the State Investigations Committee as the Coverdale entity to do independent investigations. I, for one, am not satisfied with certainly what they've reported. I don't want to say that their investigation was inadequate, but from this report, I don't have a full grasp of it. And what I would propose to do to make this constructive is that we ask that some representative come in, and in the interim, I promise to, and I'm sure other commissioners will join in this, send them a letter asking them to detail responses to certain questions. At the very least, I'd like a list of the cases. I would note in passing a comment that Dr. Jenny made in the last meeting, and that had to do with the problem here, he pointed out, is the person that does the supervision of the analyst. How did they miss these results? I see in the report that one thing they say here is that the analysts were the ones that were picking which cases they would give to the supervisors.
In the future.
I'm curious as to whether that applied in any other disciplines in the New York City crime lab. Was it just latent prints where the analysts would pick which ones they were going to show to the supervisor, or is that something that was going on in other disciplines? Was that question even asked?
There are two motions pending now. I don't know if there's a third motion that anybody wants to make, but there is a motion to ask the SIC to come to answer further questions regarding the report. There is, I guess I would make a motion to basically, well, I'll withdraw that motion. There is a motion to have the SIC come. I guess it's is there a second to the motion?
I made the motion.
Is it Zybar's motion? I'm seconding it.
Okay. All in favor, please indicate by raising your hand. Okay, 2, 4. 4 in favor of asking the SIC to come and answer questions. All opposed, raise your hand. Somebody else.
Jesus, we're in trouble. You better take back that. That's useless.
6 opposed. Okay, so the motion is not carried. I just want to say for the record that the SIC is not continuing to be the investigative body for this agency, or for the commission. So I think the idea that we want to give them more direction about how to conduct investigations is not really warranted. I understand that other commissioners may have questions about the investigation, and certainly you're entitled to those questions. Dr. Jenny?
What I find lacking in this report, and also the letter to Mr. Keaton on controlled substances, it really doesn't address quality systems failures, whether in fact there is a root cause problem in these laboratories that need to be addressed. What we're doing is a retrospective in identifying causes, but what's being expressed, in fact, if there were adequate quality systems, there may be a good chance that those errors may never occur. And it's unfortunate, I think, that the commission, the SIC, that didn't have that mindset. That's looking forward, that there be prompt reporting to DAs, but it's not really looking at the cause. That is of immediate concern to this commission. And if, in fact, the SIC is to be a party to some of these investigations, obviously we don't conduct independent investigation. I would find it valuable to have that feedback from such a commission.
Just as a matter of information, of course, there's one remaining matter before the SIC, also concerning the NYPD laboratory. So I would expect that report may come to us at the next meeting. We'll make a special point to ask.
It won't be here.
That may present an opportunity at least to have any other further discussions they want to bring up at that time.
I subscribe completely to Dr. Jenny's remarks. I just don't think that they were adequately looking at this from the point of view of root causes or crime lab review. And what I would really be thinking here is that this is one that, pending more data from them, I would move, but I'm not going to do it right now, that the Inspector General look at. I actually don't see this as divorced from the other problems that we saw in ballistics or in drugs in the New York City Police Department crime lab. We need answers to these questions about how that place is running. And but what the motion obviously didn't carry, but what I will do is write them letters and make Freedom of Information Act requests to try to get more data from them with respect to this investigation. It's disappointing that they weren't able to come to this meeting. And that's all just to share with you, with the idea that it might be appropriate, given what answers, if any, they give, to send this one to the Inspector General. I'm not making that motion now because I want more data. But I wholly subscribe with Dr. Jenny's remarks.
May I also just make the point, I think, that, of course, this matter will be reviewed, I imagine, again, under the next ASPIDE lab inspection. So they'll review the issue, what remediation took place, and perhaps through that come to some information that might sort of answer Dr. Jenny's questions. I don't know if Keith would want to respond to that.
Well, we definitely will be looking at that anytime we have a report of this nature. We will follow up on it at the next inspection.
I couldn't hear that answer.
Well,
Yeah, could you just speak into the microphone, please?
to respond to John's comments, ASPIDE Lab will definitely look into how this was handled during our next inspection of the laboratory, which is a standard practice when we have a matter of this nature.
Now, will you have a way of getting the report, or is that something that we have to follow up on?
It's
We may have to do
publicly
that.
available, but I'll communicate and correspond to be sure you have a copy of the report.
Well, I think anytime there is a report that's issued to the commission, we should make sure it goes to ASPIDE Labs as a operating procedure. I also, I'm sorry.
Just one question. Looking at this report, this is obviously not an investigation report detail in their whole investigation. I think this is basically their finding. But from personal knowledge, I think this matter was fully also investigated by the NYPD, and they've taken the action that they deemed appropriate. So I think
We can't hear this.
no, I think we're looking at this as a full investigation report, and that's not what this is. But, you know, if you speak to the laboratory director, I mean, we need to ask the question, have they investigated this matter? To my knowledge, they've completely investigated this matter, according to who they should be reported to.
Yes, we have investigated it fully, I believe, and we've taken many steps to improve the quality system in that particular area, even though at the time, as I indicated, it was not an incredible discipline. It did not fall to the auspices of Asclat Lab. At that time, when this thing was first exposed, the technical reviews that were being done were 6 cases per month per examiner, or 20% of the cases they did, or whichever was less. Incorporated into that technical review process was a verification process where another examiner would look at the work of the primary examiner and determine if it was done accurately. The weakness, as quite correctly pointed out by the Commission of Investigation, was that this was done post-analysis by the primary examiner. Subsequently, in January of 2005, we instituted several different processes to eliminate that. And I also want to point out that regardless of how efficacious your quality system is, it's never going to be foolproof. So we shouldn't be fooled by that. However, let me point out the steps we did take, and the Commission of Investigation did note that. One, we eliminated that process where the examiner, post-analysis, selects what cases are going to be technically reviewed. Number one, all cases are technically reviewed. It's a 100% verification versus now a minimum of 20% for 6 cases per month. That's per examiner per month. Additionally, during that technical review process, the supervisor looks at the photographic images to determine whether the examiner has accurately described the prints that are of value. Secondly, there is a verification process. Now that's a 6 or 20%, but that is pre-analysis. That's determined before the examiner begins to work on a case. Now we've gone a step further than what any average laboratory would have done in terms of a traditional verification, which is to actually look at the evidence. This is a shadowing process where another examiner is present during the entire examination process from beginning to end. At any point along that process, that second examiner can say, well, you've made a mistake. There's something wrong with what you did. If that discrepancy cannot be worked out, it's brought to the attention of a supervisor. On top of that, we have a third layer of quality, and that is, by random process, the supervisor of the unit recalls cases from either the evidence control room, where all this evidence is stored prior to going to the Property Bureau, or it's recalled from the Property Bureau. The examiners have no idea what cases are going to be looked at again. The supervisor reopens the case and re-examines the materials which were evidentiary in nature. So there's an awful lot that's being done for at least a year and a half now, way beyond what we were doing at that time. I also like to point out, philosophically, it should be noted that it was yours truly, on behalf of the NYPD, that I urged this commission at the last meeting to adopt the New York State DA's Association's guidelines on notifications as regulations of this commission. At the last commission meeting, the initial discussion was that CLAC would adopt it as a sort of agreement between the laboratories. I saw a weakness in that, even on a member, I'm actually assistant chair of CLAC, and I had recommended this commission that it adopt that guideline as a requirement so that laboratory directors fully understand what the requirements are and the structure above them of the parent agency. Know in advance the laboratory director has no choice but to make notifications. I also wanted to point out a mistake in a minor mistake in the commission's report. report, they indicated that August of '06 that the laboratory officials notified the DA's office. That's incorrect. It was actually in June after all was said and done. The commission made a mistake. They mistook that for a report that was issued by the chief of detectives to the DA's office. That actually did occur in August. And as far as a list of cases, I don't think you need to file a Freedom of Information to do that. I would be glad to provide that if I can get that. We certainly have a list of the cases that we considered. We compiled a complete list of all the cases that Phyllis Martin worked on. And you're certainly entitled to that. I have no problem providing that voluntarily.
Right, thank you. You should stay at the table because we'll be taking up another issue regarding the NYPD lab, if you will. All right, the next item on our agenda does address laboratory disclosure of non-compliance issues to ASCLD labs. And I'll ask John Hicks to report on two matters. John?
Yes, you were provided in your packet a copy of a letter from Dr. Pizzola to Bud Keaton, the Executive Director of ASCLD Lab, notifying them of an incident that they had in 2003 in which two examiners were found to have issued a false positive test result. And so, accordingly, that information was provided to ASCLD Lab with the understanding that this is a reportable failure or error in the laboratory processes. So you have the letter from Dr. Pizzola, which describes in great detail the nature of how the steps that they took to address the issue.
The issue and the letters that we received from two ASCLD labs from Director Pizzola was received after our last commission meeting, but it very clearly met the standards requiring a referral to an independent investigative body. So I did take the liberty immediately to refer that, this time to the Inspector General, and you have a copy of that letter dated April 20th, 2007, referring this matter to the Inspector General for investigation. I understand that investigation is still ongoing at this point. And again, I'd like to ask if there's anything we want to discuss with the Commission at this point about that matter.
Sure. And to do that, again, I'd like to point out that this shows the philosophy. You asked the question rhetorically, I think, about how this laboratory is run. And I think the notification to ASCLD Lab and ECJS of what was delineated in this report in April 12th gives you some idea, and not an entire one, of how this laboratory is run. I could say that it's part of that quality system is to report any significant findings that we find of non-compliance and non-conformance. We could have easily, when we first thought about this in March of this year, stopped and waited for John Hicks or Commissioner Scheck, Commissioner Neufeld to come forward and tell us what laboratory was involved with the dry lab. We could have laid back and waited. We didn't. We took a proactive approach, and we asked ourselves, are they talking about us? And if they are, why? If they were notified properly of a dry labbing incident, which was common knowledge in the lab from the year 2002, why wasn't the Commission aware if they hadn't properly reported? So these are the questions that we asked ourselves. And I directed Vinny Crispino, my quality assurance manager, to look into and verify that the Commission and ASCLD Lab had been properly reported to. Unfortunately, we found out that there wasn't reported. We found out that same day that another instance involving another examiner was not reported. And these were significant issues There were two instances of what we would consider level 1 non-performances for each examiner that had not been reported. It was so significant that the police department suspended both individuals, so it must have had a huge impact on the laboratory, a positive one, I hope. But the fact is, it wasn't reported, and it was our opinion it should have been reported. It was very clear. And there was a third examiner who we consider a level 2 incident a false negative. At the time that we were looking at this in April and reported to Westchester Lab, we were not sure of the extent of the corrective action that had taken place. Since then, we've come to realize that there were weaknesses, certainly with respect to parts of the corrective action. Particularly, for example, with the examiner, Dolores Soriano, who was, this was a false negative that she had been involved with. She was never notified, apparently, of a false negative on a blind proficiency test. We brought this to her attention in April. Subsequently, we realized as we were going through the corrective action that the laboratory had not taken her off casework. They had not reviewed any of her cases at that time period in 2002. And of course, traditionally, the laboratory, and most laboratories would go back at least 1 year to the time of the prior proficiency test. This had apparently not been done. So on April 24th, or thereabouts, she was removed from casework this year. And she will not be returned until we go through many cases of hers that we are looking back at from the present time to 2001. So between Dolores Soriano, Elizabeth Mansour, and R.J. Patel, we are looking at approximately 3,000 cases. And I really can't go into too much more detail because obviously the Inspector General is conducting an active investigation in which we are fully cooperating.
Again, all of the affected district attorneys are now aware of the situation.
Yes, they were notified during the same time period that Asclad Lab and DCGS was notified. They were given copies of the same report that you received. And then at a customers working group, which is, our association that we put together with the DA's offices to keep them apprised of these issues and other laboratory developments, they were fully made aware of what basically I've been telling you now.
Yes.
First of all, I'd like to thank Peter for the assistance that he provided to the crime lab directors and particularly to the DA's Association in drafting guidelines, which is now part of the record. I'd also suggest that we withhold any comments on this until the Inspector General is finished with her investigation, and that perhaps if we do have questions, as Dr. Jenny suggested earlier, that we submit them either through you, to Chris Heyman, or directly to her, whatever you prefer to report on that. And I think Peter is dealing with the situation head on. Obviously, this is not shying away from anything, and just suggest that we go from there.
That's a good suggestion. I do think Dr. Jenny's suggestions about prospectively providing questions to the Inspector General is a good one. Whether the Inspector General, decides that they're meritorious or not, is going to be up to the Inspector General, but I think it could be very helpful. Anyone can contact the Inspector General's office. It doesn't have to be funneled through the Commission, but since we have made a formal recommendation or referral, from the Commission, I would appreciate it if you would send me questions of concern that you may have about this matter. It should be forwarded to the Inspector General. I would agree that we should withhold our discussion about this until we hear from the report. But if you do have specific issues that you think should be addressed, if you could provide them to me relatively expeditiously, I would appreciate it, because the matter has been now with the Inspector General since April. So they're definitely moving along with their investigation. I think the efforts that have been undertaken at NYPD to address this situation have been very substantial. I appreciate your directness and the way that you dealt with the situation and bringing it to our attention when you did. And any other questions or discussions?
I'd like to ask a question, if I may, about what's on page 6. And obviously, if somehow or other this seems sensitive, then you can simply say that, and I won't press the issue. But there's an item under April 10, 2003, and this regards Mr. Patel. In his defense, he stated that during an interview, apparently, he said that he failed to clean his test plates, causing the failure of these tests. That was what he was asserting as a defense. And I guess my question is, in terms of supervision, is it possible, or was it possible in 2002 or whatever, for an examiner to conduct series of tests without his test plate being changed or cleaned and gone unnoticed by supervision? Is that possible?
First, let me point out that I wasn't with the department at that time, so I'm not sure what was.
This is not directed towards you. I'm just, if you know, if you don't know.
I really can't answer that. If that was the answer, however, I think that was a poor response.
Yeah, well, if that's the answer and it's true, then what value was any test he ever did?
I'm sorry. If your claim is that your test plate was dirty, then you're deficient as an examiner.
Oh, for sure.
Shockingly, maybe he lied.
Yes, shockingly, he might have lied. Yeah, I can't.
And by the way, did anybody check to see if Elizabeth Mansour really had a heart attack on the day? Sounds like a great way to get a disability child.
She either apparently had a panic attack or a heart attack, and she never returned to the laboratory.
It's nice to know as a taxpayer, though, that she's not getting a government check for the rest of her life. Because of the stress you put her under.
Well, no, that was prior to my
Okay, there's one other item. John, if you could just briefly outline the
Right, this
second
is
item.
notification. You see a letter that was directed by the
putting that question to them.
Chief Medical Examiner's DNA laboratory to New York City, directed to the class lab, notifying them of a communication that they had received from a contractor who was actually a contractor to the NYPD, processing potential DNA evidence. And I think the letter and communication is self-explanatory. The contractor apparently noted that took it upon themselves to review the work that had been done, and in so doing, they had a higher number of positive results when they re-examined the materials, and as a consequence, they indicated that they altered their conclusions. So the DNA laboratory apparently felt that this is something that should be reported to ASCLAB lab, and we, I don't know if there's any comment or discussion.
Well, at one time, we talked about the issue of the Coverdale requirements extending to the contractors of the forensic lab, and the value of making sure that this commission notified all of those contract labs that they might then be embroiled in this kind of ritual. Appropriately so, but we never did resolve whether the DOH-regulated forensic DNA lab should receive the copy of your communication with the DPHJS accredited lab. So they, Bodie, might not know that this kind of error, whatever the root cause, might end up in such an independent investigation and might result in these kinds of notices. I mean, I have no problem suggesting either giving you the list of the approved accredited DNA labs We don't accredit any, well, we might have some forensic tox labs out there.
Cody is an approved,
They are approved.
health department approved.
Yes. I could give you the list and you could send your letter, or we could agree on some kind of a letter that we would send to them. Because I don't know that our private labs, LabCorp doing the STRs, or know that in agreeing to contract with, I'm not trying to disrupt the contracts, it's just a matter of information sharing.
Since this is one of your accredited laboratories, I mean, what response would you expect from them?
I'm really getting to a different issue. I'm getting to the issue of they do not perhaps know that as a contractor to one of the DCJS labs, they are subject to Coverdale because they don't know that they've ever been told. We haven't told them that because we never resolved whether we were telling them that.
Well, Coverdale aside, I don't see Coverdale has any, we've been notified, I guess.
With this kind of an error on what might be discovered, it's a QC error, it's an incident report, it would be reviewed at time of inspection, and the laboratory would be asked, so what did you do and how did you fix it, and what's the root cause, and it would be reviewed in the process of it. We do not have an interim reporting requirement for the DLH labs. Right? No.
Well, Ann Walsh is now aware of this
Right.
through the mission report, so she is head of her forensic bacteria unit.
I can tell you that Vogue Technology has fully disclosed the issue to ASPLAT.
I would also say that because we are erring on the side of full disclosure and we are asking labs, or labs are reporting this to us, that we are getting them here, we are making the commission aware that we are going to have to exercise our discretion about whether it's appropriate to refer matters for independent investigation, or we're not going to find a body that's big enough to handle all of the matters. And this one, in my estimation, does not meet the standard for referring to an outside independent agency. That doesn't address your issue of the fact that we can have contracting labs that we may have issues with that do meet the standard. The Inspector General has jurisdiction in New York State, not elsewhere. So any lab located in another area of the country would have to be investigated by an Inspector General or some entity in that part of the country.
It's not true under DOH permit requirements, since we do issue them a permit from the state of New York, even though they're in New Jersey or Washington.
So we may accredit them here in New York, but I'm just saying in terms of...
Inspector General can inspect them relevant to their accreditation issued by New York. So
they may be able to, whether they have the resources to do it, may be an issue for us.
I mean, LabCorp
fly and do an investigation in Chicago or someplace may present some issues that we'll have to address if we, with any independent investigatory body right now in New York, that may present some practical issues.
Could I just ask, has the health department had a situation where you conducted some follow-up investigation based on a report of this nature?
Maybe not in forensics, but we have an entire LIU unit that when we get complaints of a lab having made a serious error or having botched clinical cases, yes, we have our own staff of investigators who take along a lab consultant inspector and go in and retrieve the records, sometimes retrieve the specimens.
Out-of-state laboratories?
Absolutely, any lab holding our permit.
Okay, thank you.
Can I make a comment on the Bodie incident?
Yes.
Commissioner, this is Mackie Prince from the OCME. So we wrote this letter. This project is a joint project with the NYPD, where the NYPD is a customer paying for the DNA testing, and we are, as the local CODIS laboratory, the entity that reviews the data and guarantees the quality of the data for the FBI accreditation for CODIS data. So Dr. Pizzola consulted Bud Keaton, whose responsibility in a scenario like this, where 3 laboratories are involved, whose responsibility is it to do the self-reporting to ASCLD Lab? And Mr. Keaton advised us that Bodie has a primary responsibility because they are accredited by ASCLD Lab, And we, as the data review entity, would have the secondary responsibility, and even the NYPD would have, if anything, a tertiary responsibility. So just in order to not default on the reporting requirements that any quality issues that go up to a corrective action level need to be reported within 30 days to ASCLAD, we reported this. Since then, we have received a pretty substantial corrective action follow-up report from Bodie, and we are satisfied that they addressed the issue and all the cases have been re-examined, the procedure has been changed, and that the future work is okay.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Our next meeting dates tentatively are September 17, 2007, December 5, 2007. We can survey all of you to see if you are able to attend. If you can check your calendars out, that would be very helpful. So we'll know that we can lock in those dates. Is there any other new business?
Yes, Commissioner O'Donnell.
Yes.
I apologize for interrupting. Greg Turkin for the New York City Police Department. Just a follow-up to some of the things that were discussed during the Phyllis Martin aspect by Dr. Pizzola. Mr. Shack, obviously we accept your request for the list of the 1,400 cases. I agree with Dr. Pizzola that you won't need to file a FOIL request for them, but it is something I believe needs to be run up the chain of command as to whether we can, in fact, release all 1,400 cases. I believe that a large portion, or if you don't want to call it a large portion, several of those are open investigation cases. There were no arrests made. And there may be some requirements for us not to release all 1,400 names, but obviously, as you can tell by Dr. Pizzola's comments and the fact that we have been fully cooperative with all the outside investigative bodies, and we intend to continue to be open in this investigation, that I doubt that there'll be much of a problem about getting that information. But I just can't promise to you that you're going to receive all 1,400 cases at this point in time. It's going to have to be looked into, and we'll provide the commission with a final response, either a response indicating that we will or will not go ahead with all 1,400, or actually the list of cases will be turned over, as Dr. Pizzola discussed. So
I greatly appreciate that and remain very sensitive to the problem of ongoing investigations. And the only reason that I'm bringing this up is that and I'm sure our colleagues in the district attorney's offices would agree. I just want to make sure that, it's the initial part of this process, and I credit Dr. Pizzola and Ms. Fitzpatrick for putting these guidelines together. The first step is notifying the DAs. But I have a question in my own mind, whether it might be wise, and it's something that the district attorneys might consider notifying the defense lawyers as well. In matters like this. But, the first step is the DAs, and it would be interesting to see in how many instances defense lawyers were notified and how much of a difference that would make. And that's really what my interest is here.
I understand. I don't know that we'll ever be able to answer that part of the question for you, but certainly the list and the notification to the DAs is something that will be taken up.
And I appreciate it.
All right, thank you very much. Our meeting is adjourned.
How many cases are you going to get? Guys, what you going to get?
To the left. A couple of left. Hey, right to the left. Make a song. Let's see who's training.
To the context.
Yeah.